Welcome back to the Bob Fu Report. Today, we're going to talk about the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, her trip to China. The last High Commissioner's trip to China that was allowed was 17 years ago. So the world has been really waiting and with high expectation for her trip. So this time, the new High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, she finally made her trip. She claimed not an investigation trip, but a trip to dialogue with the Chinese Communist Party leaders. What precedented this trip? For the past 5 years, Bachelet has requested to come to China to visit after she took the reign as the High Commissioner. Last September, she said she has taken up her independent monitoring mandate. Her office promised a report in a matter of weeks about the genocide, the tremendous reported and verified abuses in Xinjiang, in particular, against the ethnic minorities over there. And certainly, with the shadow of the Chinese Communist Party's unprecedented crackdown on human rights, religious freedom, rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of press, you name them. But even with this report, this Xinjiang report, her office had not released it even before or during and now even after her trip. There is still no report. Of course, the Communist Party has kept her visit in a quote-unquote closed loop in the name of the COVID-19, the Communist Party virus. So she literally had a bubbled human rights trip to China at this time. So most of her visits, her events in China basically were closely guided, handled by her Communist Party security or official handlers. It is definitely a manipulated trip by the CCP. And the many world, especially the free world governments, including the United States, actually call her to pause or not doing the trip at all because the Communist Party's preparedness to manipulate, exploit her trip for their propaganda purpose. So this is one of the comments from my good friend Dr. Sophia Richardson, the China director of Human Rights Watch. So Dr. Richardson said after her visit, the world's leading human rights diplomat at Michelle Bachelet just failed to challenge the second most powerful government on earth over some of the gravest crimes under international human rights law. So in the end, her visit turned to be a human rights disaster. It's useless because she was not given unfettered, meaningful, free access to any of the Chinese concentration camps. There was a window dressing, so-called, the Communist Party authority call it vocational training facilities in Xinjiang. And of course, colored and protected, whitewashed by the Communist Party officials during her visit. And the most outrageous, I think, thing happened during her visit was on May 28th. At the end of her visit, the High Commissioner basically issued a statement in a online press conference without taking much meaningful question on her trip. This is what she said. I quote, she said, "I should state from the outset what this visit was. This visit was not an investigation. It was an opportunity to hold direct discussions with China's most senior leaders on human rights." End quote. Well, if you want to just have a dialogue, have a conversation with the Chinese Communist Party leaders, security leaders, academics, you can do that from Geneva, from your office, and virtually, like she did. Was in even the Communist Party was so happy for her dedication to whitewash, cover up for their human rights records. In the last minute, they arranged the highest level meeting, a virtual meeting between her and dictator Xi Jinping. So she was already in China, and Xi Jinping was sitting in Zhongnanhai, the China's White House in Beijing, by a virtual meeting after wasting the UN's fund traveling there, and 2/3 of them actually are paid by our American taxpayers. It is nothing but an embarrassment. It is really a betrayal to those who are, millions of Chinese who are still suffering under this dictator, Xi Jinping. So, what discussions she had there in China with the perpetrators of genocide and crimes against humanity? As the Uyghur Tribunal in London already concluded, and the U.S. State Department legally already pronounced it's a genocide that has been happening in China. So she was basically invited there to be a propagandist embedded with the Communist Party's propaganda machine. This is another quote that displayed this embedded propaganda of the Communist Party by this UN Human Rights High Commissioner. She said, I quote, "Violent acts of extremism have a terrible, serious impact on the lives of victims, including those tasked to protect the community. But it is critical that counterterrorism response do not result in human rights violations." End quote. It's beyond outrage for this characterization of the measures the Communist Party has taken. Basically refers to what's happening in Xinjiang in the past 5 years. She characterized this with the Communist Party's exactly same language. The concentration camp has become the measure of anti-extremism, counter-terrorism. And all of a sudden, this 360 plus concentration camps, she believed Communist Party's propaganda, believed in it as a vocational training to de-extremism or de-terrorism effort. And in this quote, she even quote this, called the Communist Party the perpetrators of genocide, as those who are tasked to protect the community. How much protections? Oscar Guerrero, who spent 16 months in this concentration camp like hell. Oscar Joseph Overbeck, who was just recently rescued by a group of our team leaders and organizations. As a Christian, he suffered 10 months in the concentration camps, being abused, tortured. It's just beyond imagination. This Human Rights High Commissioner of the UN would call these abusers as the community protectors. So Bachelet is totally guilty of using the CCP's propaganda and vocabulary to talk about this genocide, this crisis, this crime against humanity. So there is no way for any High Commissioner on Human Rights to address these atrocities, especially right after the release of the Xinjiang police files this past week. In these profiles, this leaked document, many of them are top secret, directly from the Chinese police computers, with over 2,800 these victims of so-called the students in the vocational training. The youngest is 15 years old. The oldest is 73. They're still needing vocational training. And plus, in these appalling documents, it quoted, not only quoted, it basically released the whole, multiple speeches, the secret speeches from Xi Jinping's quotation directives to the Minister of Public Security, Mr. Guo Shengkun. And of course, the party secretary of Xinjiang, Mr. Chen Quanguo, who has been in the sanction list by President Trump. It has a direct order to kill. Basically, if in the document it said if any one of these supposedly vocational training student dare to escape after the first warning shot, and a police or security officer in these concentration camps, in these so-called vocational training schools, can directly shoot them, kill them before filing a report later. These are very credible documents that's already been authenticated by the world experts and the media as well. So how could she fail to even mention a word, utter a sentence, to even ask a question, to confront it? These communist parties vicious victims. I mean, the word highest human rights officer would go to China at this critical time, missed such an opportunity to at least let the murderers know that we do care. Let those Communist Party know, officials, that we want to hold them accountable. And by the way, here's the mandate by the UN General Assembly to her office, this High Commissioner on Human Rights Office. It says, High Commissioner shall be guided by the recognition that all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social, are universal. And while some of the cultural, historical, religious backgrounds must be borne in mind, it is the duty of the states, regardless of their political, whether you're communist or socialism or whatever your political, economic, and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the quote, this is passed by the UN General Assembly for the mandate of a Human Rights Commissioner. And yet, throughout her trip, not only she failed in every aspect of her job description, but also she become part of the problem, accomplice, a window dressing cover-up tool for the Communist Party. So, yes, she said her goal for her trip, her 10 days trip in China, is not to investigate. She's not an investigator. She won't be allowed to investigate anything. But the tragedy is her whole even supposed to be a fact-finding or dialogue trip has been used by the CCP to whitewash genocide. Can you believe that a UN High Commissioner went to Hitler's Germany in 1930s, 1940s, and after meeting with Hitler and made a statement and said, oh, well, the country should be careful when it is engaging its ethnicity policy or racial imbalance policy. Can you believe that? You know how outrageous the word would be. But this exactly happened under her trip. She has betrayed those she's supposed to be fighting for, those victims, not only in Xinjiang, across China. You have Pastor Wang Yi, 9 years in prison, and the church, hundreds of thousands of churches had been demolished, pastors has been sentenced, and believers were sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for printing Bibles. She has failed in everything she's supposed to protect. So it's no wonder I think it's already a unanimous consensus, including our organization, China Aid. We demand she apologize for her failed trip by failing to raise the human rights, but also to apologize for covering up for the Communist Party's propaganda and genocide. She needs to be held accountable. She needs to immediately removed or resign from her post. So, is there any hope? I mean, I myself remember some years ago, before the UN Human Rights Council was created, it was called UN Human Rights Commission. I was sponsored to testify, and just because I ran in legally with the normal procedure, getting through all the metal security detectors with a smuggled electric shock baton from China. And because I was talking about my friend, Pastor Cai Zhuohua in Beijing, who was tortured with electric shock batons, so I basically turned on the electric shock baton when I was speaking. I was being arrested in the parameters in the Human Rights Hall, Human Rights Commissioners in the hall, and put in the UN police car and kicked out. I think that was the first time, to talk about a witness to expose the human rights abuses, and was being put in a police car. So I told the press and also, following congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., that was my second time in a police car. The last time was I was arrested, put in a police car, was in Beijing, 1996, being accused of illegal religious activity participants, and later as a house church leader. And this time, I have never thought the UN would do the same thing to me. Of course, because of that, they are so embarrassed, so ashamed, they changed its name from UN High Commission on Human Rights to UN Human Rights Council Now you have Russia, you have Cuba, you have North Korea, you have all the kind of Iran. Many, those world worst, of course China, the worst human rights abusers are sitting in the Human Rights Council to monitor global human rights. What an irony. And it's an embarrassment. Friends, I think we need to maybe to pray, especially in America as taxpayers, we need to really think harder whether we should continue to supply their 2/3 of operation fund, maybe 2/3 or half, even 1/3. To use our taxpayers' money to do propaganda for the human rights abusers by the UN High Commissioners. And even she spent more time, in her press conference, talk about America's gun violence or racial issues than about China. 2/3 of her time were about America's gun violence. So these 2 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other people in Xinjiang, it seems, in the concentration camp. So they are, Michelle's eyes, the ears, and minds, they are way less important than the racial or gun violence issue in America. So this is outrageous. So we let's all work together to not only hold the Communist Party accountable for its human rights violations, but also to pray that there should be meaningful reform on her office, on her rule, and certainly she needs to wrap up and leave that official post. And maybe the Communist Party will offer her a better job in the Central Committee of the Propaganda Department. She has certainly done a way better job on that front.
Thank you, Bob, for that report. Again, the Xinjiang police files were leaked this recent week by victims of communism. There were over 28,000 detainee records, thousands of photos of inmates. There were, like Bob said, these secret speeches given by Chinese Communist Party officials, essentially implicating Xi Jinping himself and other high-ranking Communist Party members. You can check out all of this at the Xinjiang Police Files.org. And you can find out more information about what are in these files and what they mean on our website, ChinaAid.org. In our last story today, I just wanted to briefly update our viewers on Elder Hao Ming. He is an elder of Qingcaodi Church, which is an offshoot of Early Rain Covenant Church in Chengdu. Qingcaodi is in Deyang, Sichuan province, and his lawyer was finally able to visit him after 6 months. As some of our viewers may know, he was arrested in November for charges of illegal business operations. Apparently, his lawyer reported that his health is in poor condition, so please be praying for him and the believers of Qingcaodi and Early Rain Covenant Church. Thank you so much for tuning into the broadcast. We'll see you next time.